You said I was a curse the night you threw me out at 9 years old. 21 years later, my parents stood outside my gate asking me for money. The security monitor beside my kitchen lit up just as I poured my first cup of coffee that morning. 2 figures stood outside the wrought-iron gates of my property, small beneath the grey Seattle sky. For a second, I didn't recognize them. Time had a way of softening even the sharpest memories. But then the woman lifted her face toward the camera, and my stomach tightened in a way I hadn't felt in years. Sandra Cole. My mother. My father stood beside her with his hands buried awkwardly in the pockets of an old brown jacket. Richard Cole had always looked uncomfortable around difficult things. That hadn't changed. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. My coffee cooled in my hand while 21 years of silence pressed against my chest like cold concrete. They looked older now. Smaller somehow. The kind of old age that comes hard and fast after too many bad decisions. My mother's blonde hair had faded into a brittle shade of grey, and my father's shoulders curved inward like he'd spent years apologizing without ever speaking the words aloud. The intercom buzzed. "Ethan," my mother's voice said softly. Too softly. "We just want to talk." I almost laughed at that. 21 years earlier, she hadn't wanted to talk when she shoved my backpack into my arms and told me I brought misery into her house. I still remembered the sound of rain hitting the porch that night. The wet pavement. The porch light shutting off after the front door slammed behind me. "You ruin everything," she'd said. "Ever since you were born." I had stood there for almost an hour waiting for my father to come back outside. He never did. Now they stood in front of a $7 million estate overlooking Lake Washington while my company's black town car sat in the driveway behind me waiting to take me downtown for a board meeting. Funny how life worked. The cursed little boy they abandoned now owned more property than they'd probably seen in their entire lives combined. My assistant had warned me this might happen someday. 3 months ago, a business magazine ran a cover story calling me one of the youngest self-made tech founders in the Pacific Northwest. My face had been everywhere after that. Interviews, podcasts, financial articles. Success had a way of attracting people who once prayed for your failure. The intercom buzzed again. "Please," my father said quietly this time. "We don't have anyone else." That sentence landed differently than I expected. Not because I felt sorry for them. I didn't. But because I suddenly realized they actually believed blood still meant something after what they'd done. I walked closer to the monitor and studied their faces carefully. My mother looked nervous. My father looked tired. Neither of them looked ashamed. That was the part that surprised me most. After everything, they still thought they could ring my bell like ordinary parents visiting their son. My thumb hovered over the gate controls for several long seconds. Then I set my coffee down beside the marble counter and pressed the speaker button. "You shouldn't have come here," I said calmly. My mother's eyes filled instantly with tears. She had always been good at that. "Ethan," she whispered, "we're family." I looked at the screen without blinking. Then I remembered the rain. The cold. The little boy sitting alone at a bus station with $43 in his backpack and nowhere to go. Family. That word meant something very different to me now. I kept my finger on the speaker button for a moment after the line went silent. Outside the gates, my mother wiped beneath her eyes while my father stared down at the wet pavement like he wanted to disappear into it. Seattle rain drifted softly across the camera lens, blurring them for a second before the image sharpened again. Strange how memory worked. I had spent years trying to forget their faces, but now every detail came rushing back so clearly it almost made my chest ache. My mother used to stand at the kitchen sink every morning with a cigarette between her fingers and tell me not to touch anything because bad things followed me wherever I went. I was 9 years old the first time she called me cursed. Old enough to understand the word. Too young to understand why a mother would say it to her own child. The worst part was that she actually believed it. After my little sister died from pneumonia as a baby, something inside her broke. The doctors explained it had nothing to do with me. Everyone explained it. But grief does strange things to people who are already looking for someone to blame. Every flat tire became my fault. Every unpaid bill. Every argument between my parents. My mother would look at me with those cold blue eyes and say, "Everything started going wrong after you came into this family." At first my father defended me sometimes. I remember that clearly. He would tell her to stop. He would say I was just a child. But over the years, even that faded away. It was easier for him to stay quiet than fight with her. Easier to look away than stand beside me. Silence can damage a person just as deeply as cruelty. Maybe deeper. I remember one winter evening when I was 8 years old. Our furnace broke during a snowstorm, and the house turned so cold I could see my breath inside my bedroom. My mother stood in the hallway wrapped in a blanket and whispered to my father that the house itself felt sick because of me. I heard every word through the thin walls. After that, I stopped speaking much at home. Children learn quickly when they are unwanted. They become smaller. Quieter. Careful not to take up space. The only person who ever treated me normally back then was Mrs. Harper from across the street. She was a retired school teacher with silver hair and reading glasses that always slid down her nose. Sometimes she would leave sandwiches on her porch for me wrapped in paper towels. Turkey. Peanut butter. Ham and cheese if she had extra money that week. She never asked questions directly. She just looked at me with sad eyes like she already knew enough. One afternoon she caught me sitting alone on the curb after school while rainwater soaked through my sneakers. She handed me a cup of hot chocolate and asked me why I always looked so nervous going home. I lied and told her I was fine. She nodded slowly like she understood children who lied to survive. Looking back now, I think she knew exactly what kind of house I lived in. The strange thing is I still loved my parents then. Even after everything. A child can survive on very little kindness if he believes someday it will grow into love. That was my mistake. I kept waiting for them to become the parents I saw other kids had. The kind who packed lunches and cheered at little league games and hugged their children when they were scared. I kept believing if I stayed quiet enough, useful enough, invisible enough, maybe they would finally want me. Outside my gates, my mother lifted her face toward the security camera again. Older now. Softer looking. But some wounds cut too deep for time to smooth over. The night they finally threw me out started quietly. That is what I remember most. No screaming. No dramatic scene like the movies. Just silence hanging over the house while rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows. I came home from school that afternoon and immediately knew something felt wrong. My father was sitting at the dining room table staring at unpaid bills spread across the wood surface like pieces of a losing hand. My mother stood near the sink twisting a dish towel between her fingers without saying a word to me. Usually she found something to criticize within seconds. The way I walked. The sound of my backpack hitting the floor. The fact that I existed in the room at all. But that evening she barely looked at me. Somehow that felt worse. I made myself a peanut butter sandwich and ate alone in my bedroom while the storm outside grew heavier. Around 8 o'clock I heard my parents arguing downstairs in low voices. I could never make out every word, only fragments drifting through the vents. We cannot keep living like this. Ever since, bad luck follows him. Then silence again. I sat frozen on the edge of my bed listening to rainwater hit the gutters outside. Children always know when something terrible is coming. Around 9 my bedroom door opened slowly. My father stood there first. He looked exhausted. Older than 42. Behind him my mother crossed her arms tightly against her chest. Neither of them came farther into the room. "Pack a bag," she said flatly. At first I thought maybe we were leaving because of the storm. Maybe flooding. Maybe some emergency. I remember standing up too quickly and asking where we were going. My mother's expression hardened immediately. "You are going," she said, Not us. I still remember how the room tilted slightly after those words. Like my body could not fully understand what was happening. I looked at my father, waiting for him to correct her. He did not. He kept staring at the carpet near my feet. "Richard," my mother snapped sharply, "tell him." My father swallowed hard before finally speaking. "Maybe it is better for everyone if you stay somewhere else for a while." Somewhere else? I was 9 years old. I had nowhere else. My hand shook while I stuffed clothes into my old blue backpack. 2 shirts. Socks. My school notebook. A flashlight with weak batteries. I moved slowly because part of me believed they would stop this before it became real. Parents did not abandon their children. That happened in sad stories on television, not in ordinary neighborhoods outside Portland where people mowed their lawns on Saturdays and waved politely from driveways. But nobody stopped anything. My mother followed me to the front door while my father stayed behind in the hallway. The rain outside smelled like wet concrete and pine trees. Cold air rushed across my face when she opened the door. "You bring darkness into this house," she whispered. "Ever since the day you were born." Then she handed me the backpack. Just handed it to me like she was returning something borrowed. I stepped onto the porch because I still thought this was temporary. A punishment maybe. An hour outside before they let me back in. But then the door closed softly behind me. Not slammed. Not angry. Somehow the quietness made it hurt more. I stood there for a long time under the yellow porch light watching rainwater collect along the sidewalk. I waited for my father to open the door again. I waited for him to remember I was his son. Upstairs a bedroom light turned off. Then another. Finally the porch light disappeared too. And just like that, I understood something that would follow me for the rest of my life. Some people can stop loving you long before they stop calling themselves family. I walked nearly 4 miles that night before the rain finally stopped. My sneakers squished with every step because water had soaked through the fabric hours earlier. Portland streets looked different after midnight. Empty intersections. Flickering traffic lights. Neon signs glowing in diner windows where tired people drank coffee without noticing the small boy standing outside in wet clothes trying to stay warm. I still remember how heavy my backpack felt against my shoulders. Not because of what was inside it, but because it suddenly contained everything I owned in the world. Around 1 in the morning I ended up at a bus station downtown. The waiting area smelled like old coffee, damp jackets, and diesel fuel drifting in each time the doors opened. I sat in the far corner hugging my backpack while pretending not to be scared. Adults passed by without looking at me twice. That is the strange thing about loneliness. Most of the time it happens in public. I must have fallen asleep eventually because the next thing I remember was someone gently touching my shoulder. A security guard stood over me holding a paper cup. "Kid," he said quietly, "you cannot sleep here all night." His voice was not mean. Just tired. I nodded quickly because I had already learned scared children caused problems adults did not want to deal with. He handed me the cup. Hot chocolate. The cheap kind from a machine, but it felt warm in my freezing hands. "You got somewhere to go?" he asked. I lied and said yes. Another survival instinct. Children abandoned by their parents learn very quickly that honesty can make things worse. He looked at me for a long moment before sighing softly. "Stay until morning," he finally said. "Then figure something out." I never forgot that man. Not because he saved me. He did not. But because he gave a frightened little boy one small act of kindness without asking for anything in return. Sometimes tiny kindnesses become the reason someone survives. By sunrise my stomach hurt from hunger and exhaustion. Outside the station the city looked washed clean by rain. Office workers hurried past carrying briefcases and coffee cups. While buses hissed along wet streets. Nobody noticed the child sitting alone on a metal bench staring at the world like he no longer belonged inside it. Around 8 o'clock I heard my name. I looked up so fast my neck hurt. Mrs. Harper stood near the entrance wearing her long beige coat and holding an umbrella. Her expression shifted the second she saw me. Not surprise. Not confusion. Recognition. Like she had expected this day to come eventually. "Oh, Ethan," she whispered softly. That nearly broke me. Not the words themselves. Just the fact someone sounded sad for me. I started crying before I could stop myself. Silent tears at first. Then the kind that shakes your whole chest. Mrs. Harper sat beside me on the bench and wrapped one arm carefully around my shoulders while people walked past pretending not to notice. "You are coming with me," she said firmly. Her little house smelled like cinnamon tea and old books. She gave me dry clothes that belonged to her grandson and made scrambled eggs with toast while I sat quietly at her kitchen table staring at the steam rising from the plate. I ate too fast because I did not know when I would eat again. She pretended not to notice. Later that afternoon she made several phone calls behind the kitchen door in a low voice. I only heard fragments. 9 years old. No relatives. They put him outside. Around sunset a social worker arrived carrying folders beneath one arm. I remember looking toward the front window one last time before leaving Mrs. Harper's house. Some part of me still believed my parents might appear at the curb and say there had been a terrible mistake. But the street stayed empty. Deep down, I think I already knew the truth. They were not coming back for me. The foster system taught me two things very quickly. First, nobody stays forever. Second, people trust quiet children more than angry ones. I learned both lessons before I turned 10. The first foster home lasted 3 months. A small yellow house outside Eugene owned by a couple named Frank and Denise Porter. They were not cruel people. Just tired. They already had 3 children of their own and took foster placements mostly for the extra state money. I understood that even back then. Denise labeled food with masking tape inside the refrigerator so nobody took more than their share. Frank barely spoke during dinner except to complain about gas prices or football games on television. I slept in a converted laundry room beside the garage where the dryer rattled against the wall late into the night. Still, it was warm. Warm felt luxurious after the bus station. At school I stopped mentioning my parents entirely. When teachers asked about home, I smiled politely and changed the subject. Children can sense weakness in each other like animals sensing blood in water. The kids who cried openly about missing their families got picked apart first. I decided early that nobody would ever see me beg to be loved again. So I became useful instead. Quiet. Responsible. I cleaned dishes without being asked. Finished homework early. Stayed out of trouble. Adults like children who make their lives easier. One afternoon Mr. Porter found me sitting at the kitchen table taking apart a broken radio with a screwdriver from the junk drawer. Instead of yelling, he watched silently while I fixed a loose wire and got the sound working again. "Hey," he muttered softly. "Kid is good with machines." That moment stayed with me for years because it was the first time an adult looked at me with curiosity instead of blame. After that I started fixing everything I could find. Alarm clocks. Old televisions left on curbs. Cheap calculators from thrift stores. Broken things made sense to me. They had causes. Solutions. Patterns. Unlike people. Around 11 years old I moved again after the Porters decided they were no longer taking foster placements. Another house. Another unfamiliar bedroom. Another set of strangers pretending temporary arrangements could feel like family. That was where I met Mason Reed. He was 13, skinny as a rail, with messy brown hair and a sarcastic grin that got him into trouble constantly. He had bounced through 6 foster homes by then and carried himself like somebody twice his age. The first thing he ever said to me was, "Do not get attached to this place. Nobody stays." I hated him immediately. Because I knew he was right. But Mason became the closest thing I ever had to a brother. We stayed up late whispering about impossible futures while old pipes rattled inside the walls around us. He wanted to own motorcycles someday. I wanted enough money that nobody could ever throw me away again. That was the exact phrase I used. Mason laughed quietly and said, "Then you better become rich." Funny thing is, I never cared about wealth itself. Not really. I cared about safety, stability, control. Money just happened to buy all three. By 14, I spent hours after school inside the public library teaching myself computer programming from outdated books with cracked spines and coffee stains across the pages. The librarian started recognizing me by name because I stayed until closing almost every night. Coding felt different from the chaos I grew up with. Computers followed rules, logic, order. If something broke, there was always a reason. Somewhere along the way, I stopped imagining my parents coming back for me. The hope simply faded quietly one day like fog lifting from water. No dramatic moment. No tears. I just woke up one morning and realized I no longer checked the street whenever cars slowed near the house. That was the year I stopped being a child. By 16, I was working evenings at a diner off Interstate 5 washing dishes for $7 an hour under the table. The owner, a heavy-set man named Carl, knew I was technically too young for the late shifts, but he also knew I never complained and never missed work. Every night after school, I tied on a stained apron and stood beside industrial sinks while country music crackled softly through old ceiling speakers. Grease coated my hands. Steam fogged my glasses. Some nights my back hurt so badly I could barely stand upright by closing time. But I loved earning my own money. Even tiny paychecks felt powerful when you grew up depending on people who could abandon you whenever life became inconvenient. I rented a tiny room above a laundromat during my senior year of high school. The place smelled permanently like detergent and hot metal from the dryers downstairs. In winter, cold air slipped through cracks around the windows, and trains passing 2 blocks away rattled the walls after midnight. But the room was mine. Nobody could force me out because of bad luck or old grief or superstitions whispered in dark kitchens. That mattered more than comfort. Most nights I barely slept. I worked until midnight, finished homework at the diner counter after closing, then spent hours teaching myself programming from online forums and second-hand textbooks. My old laptop overheated constantly, so I kept a box fan pointed at it while I worked. Sometimes I fell asleep sitting upright in the chair with lines of unfinished code glowing across the screen. Mason used to call me insane. He had started working construction jobs by then and occasionally stopped by my apartment carrying cheap takeout containers and energy drinks. "You know normal teenagers go to parties, right?" he asked me once while looking around at computer parts scattered across the floor. I shrugged without glancing away from the screen. Normal teenagers probably had parents. He stopped joking after that. Around 19, I built a software tool that helped small trucking companies organize delivery routes more efficiently. Nothing revolutionary. Just practical. I sold the first version for $5,000 to a local shipping company and nearly had a panic attack holding the check in my hands afterward. $5,000 felt unreal to somebody who once counted coins for bus fare. I deposited the money and immediately went back to work because fear drove me harder than ambition ever could. Fear of being powerless again. Fear of depending on people who might disappear. Over the next several years, everything moved fast. Faster than I expected. One client became 10. 10 became hundreds. Investors started calling. Lawyers. Financial advisors. People in expensive suits suddenly treated me like someone important. By 26, I owned a growing logistics software company with offices in Seattle and Denver. Business magazines called me disciplined, focused, self-made. They loved stories like mine. The abandoned foster kid who built a tech company from nothing. Journalists always asked what inspired my work. Ethic. I never told them the truth. Trauma is easier for people to admire after it becomes profitable. The strangest part of success was how quiet it felt. Movies make achievement look triumphant. In reality, most mornings I simply sat alone in beautiful rooms drinking expensive coffee while staring out giant windows feeling older than my age. I bought the house overlooking Lake Washington because the view felt peaceful. Floor-to-ceiling glass. Black iron gates. Cedar trees lining the driveway. Safe. Secure. Controlled. Everything my childhood was not. But loneliness follows people who spend too many years surviving instead of living. Some nights I walked through 12,000 square feet of silence wondering whether success actually healed anything at all. Then 3 months ago my face appeared on the cover of Northwest Business Monthly beside the headline about billion-dollar expansion deals and rising tech founders reshaping the industry. I almost declined the interview entirely. I should have trusted my instincts. Because somewhere out there, 2 people who had not spoken to me in 21 years were suddenly reminded that the little boy they abandoned had become very valuable. I finally opened the gates after nearly 10 minutes of silence. Not because I forgave them. Not because I wanted reconciliation. I think part of me simply needed to see what 21 years of regret looked like up close. My mother and father walked slowly up the long stone driveway while rainwater dripped from the edges of their jackets. Neither of them spoke at first. They just stared quietly at the house like tourists visiting someplace they could never afford. I met them inside the front foyer where warm light reflected across polished marble floors and towering glass walls overlooked the lake beyond the trees. My mother's eyes widened slightly when she stepped inside. That reaction told me more than words ever could. She was not looking at her son. She was looking at wealth. "This place is beautiful," she whispered softly. I nodded once without inviting either of them to sit down. My father removed his damp cap awkwardly and turned it between his hands while studying the floor. Age had hollowed him out somehow. His hair was almost completely grey now, and deep lines pulled at the corners of his mouth. But I noticed something else too. Even standing inside my home after 2 decades, he still avoided direct eye contact with me. Some habits never leave people. My mother finally cleared her throat. "We saw your interview," she said carefully. "You have done very well for yourself." There it was. Not "we missed you." Not "we searched for you." Just admiration wrapped around financial success. I leaned lightly against the staircase railing and waited. Silence makes people reveal themselves eventually. "Things have been difficult lately," she continued. "Your father lost his job 2 years ago after the factory downsized." My father stared down at his shoes while she spoke for him. "Then there were medical bills," she added quietly. "And the mortgage," her voice trailed off dramatically. I almost admired how naturally she still performed sadness. Some people survive by manipulating sympathy the same way others survive by working hard. "We are trying to sell the house," my father finally muttered. His voice sounded rough with embarrassment. "But we are behind on payments." I looked at him for several seconds before asking the question that had sat inside my chest all morning. "Did either of you ever try to find me?" The room became very still after that. My mother glanced toward the giant windows overlooking the lake instead of answering immediately. "We assumed the state placed you somewhere safe," she said softly. Safe. Such a clean little word for abandonment. That was not my question. My father swallowed hard. "Your mother thought it would be better if," he stopped mid-sentence when he noticed my expression. "Better if what?" "Better if I disappeared quietly so life became easier for them? Better if the cursed child stopped reminding them of grief they never learned to survive?" My mother stepped closer suddenly, her eyes glossy with tears. "Ethan, we were young and struggling back then. We made mistakes." I almost laughed again. Mistakes were forgetting birthdays. Missing phone calls. Losing tempers. Leaving your 9-year-old son outside. In the rain was a decision. A conscious one. "Do you know what I remember most about that night?" I asked calmly. Neither of them answered. "I remember waiting for Dad to come outside after you closed the door. My father finally looked up then, and guilt flickered across his face so quickly I almost missed it. I waited because I thought surely one parent would still love me enough to come back. My mother folded her arms tightly across her chest like she was cold. Ethan, but nobody came. Silence settled over the room again. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Honest. Then my mother took a slow breath and finally said the thing she had been building toward since the moment she arrived. We were hoping maybe you could help us financially until we get back on our feet. There it was at last. The real reason they had found me. I did not answer right away after my mother asked for money. Instead, I walked slowly toward the kitchen while the silence behind me stretched tight across the room. The espresso machine hummed softly as I poured myself another cup of coffee. My hand stayed perfectly steady. That surprised me a little. Years ago this conversation would have shattered me. Now it only felt exhausting. When I turned back around, my parents were standing exactly where I had left them, small and uncomfortable inside a house built from everything they once believed I could never become. "How much do you need?" I asked finally. Relief flashed across my mother's face so quickly she could not hide it. Not relief that her son might forgive her. Relief that the strategy was working. "The bank says we need $80,000 to stop foreclosure proceedings," she said carefully. "Just until we can figure things out." $80,000. She said the number like it was reasonable. Like parents routinely appeared after 21 years asking abandoned children for the price of a luxury car. My father rubbed his forehead tiredly and finally spoke again. "We did not want it to come to this." I studied him quietly for a moment. "That is interesting," I said calmly. "Because you seemed perfectly comfortable letting things come to me sleeping in a bus station at 9 years old." He flinched slightly at that. My mother stepped in quickly before he could respond. "Ethan, we cannot change the past." "No," I agreed softly. "But the past explains the present very well." I walked across the living room toward the built-in shelving near my office and opened a drawer they could not see from where they stood. Inside sat a thin black folder my attorney had prepared years earlier after helping me seal certain foster records connected to my childhood. I carried the folder back slowly and placed it on the glass coffee table between us. My mother looked confused. My father looked nervous. "What is this?" she asked. "Proof," I answered. I opened the folder carefully. Inside were copies of state documents, shelter intake forms, foster placement records, and handwritten notes from social workers dating back more than 2 decades. My mother stared silently at the pages while color slowly drained from her face. "You told people I ran away," I said quietly. "Did you know that?" Neither of them spoke. "According to the state records, you waited 6 days before reporting me missing." My father looked physically ill now. He sank slowly onto the edge of the couch without asking permission. "Sandra said," he started weakly before stopping himself. "Sandra said what?" I asked. "That the boy she called cursed would not survive on his own." My mother's eyes filled with tears again. "We were overwhelmed," she whispered. "We were grieving." "You were grieving," I said calmly. "And instead of dealing with it, you blamed a child." The room fell silent except for rain tapping gently against the giant windows overlooking the lake. Then I pulled one final document from the folder and placed it carefully on top. My father stared at it first. His expression changed immediately. Confusion. Then shock. "What is this?" my mother asked sharply. "My grandfather's trust records," I replied. "The account he created for me before he died." Neither of them moved. "You probably thought I never found out." My father's face turned pale. "Ethan, the account originally held almost $150,000. I looked directly at my mother then. Money that disappeared less than a year after I was thrown out. She stared at me speechless while my father closed his eyes slowly like a man finally collapsing beneath the weight of something he carried too long. Suddenly everything made sense. The missing savings. The gambling debts. The foreclosure. They had not just abandoned me. They had stolen from me first. My mother sat perfectly still after I revealed the trust records. For the first time since arriving at my house, she looked genuinely shaken instead of carefully emotional. My father leaned forward on the couch with both hands covering his face while rain continued sliding down the windows behind him in slow silver streaks. Nobody spoke for nearly a full minute. Silence has weight when the truth finally settles into a room. "We meant to pay it back," my father said weakly at last. His voice sounded older than ever. "Things just got out of control." I looked at him quietly. Gambling. That was the part nobody told me until years later. My grandfather's money disappeared into sports betting, credit card debt, and desperate attempts to recover losses that only grew larger every month. Somewhere during all of it, blaming me became easier than facing themselves. Easier than admitting they were drowning because of their own choices. "Do you know what the strange part is?" I asked softly. "I probably would have helped you if you had just told me the truth from the beginning." My mother's eyes lifted sharply toward mine. Hope flickered there instantly. Dangerous hope. "Ethan, but you still came here pretending to be victims." Her expression collapsed again. "We are your parents," she whispered. "Parents do not leave their children outside in the rain and wait 6 days to report them missing." My voice stayed calm. That seemed to unsettle them more than anger would have. People expect shouting during confrontations like this. Tears. Rage. But indifference is harder to survive because it leaves no room for negotiation. I walked toward the massive windows overlooking Lake Washington and stared out across the dark water below the cliffs. Lights from distant houses shimmered softly against the surface while cedar trees swayed in the evening wind. This view had once represented success to me. Safety. Proof that nobody would ever control my life again. But standing there with my parents behind me, I suddenly realized something unexpected. I no longer needed their apology the way I once thought I did. Some wounds stop hurting not because they heal, but because you finally build a life larger than the people who caused them. I turned back toward them slowly. "I am not giving you $80,000. My father lowered his head immediately like he expected the answer. My mother looked devastated. But beneath the sadness, I still saw calculation moving behind her eyes. Measuring. Searching for another angle. "Please," she whispered. "We have nowhere to go." I walked toward the kitchen counter and pulled a small envelope from the drawer beside the refrigerator. Earlier that afternoon, before opening the gates, I had asked my assistant to reserve a hotel room downtown for 3 nights and place $5,000 inside an emergency account attached to it. Not forgiveness. Not reconciliation. Just enough to keep 2 elderly people from sleeping in their car. I placed the envelope carefully on the coffee table beside the black folder. "This covers a hotel and basic expenses for now," I said. My mother stared at the envelope without touching it. "That is all?" she asked quietly before she could stop herself. There it was again. Not gratitude. Expectation. I almost smiled. Some people never truly change. That is more kindness than you gave me. My father closed his eyes after hearing that. His shoulders sagged like something inside him had finally broken under the weight of 21 years. Slowly he stood up from the couch and picked up the envelope with trembling fingers. "Thank you," he whispered hoarsely. My mother remained frozen for several seconds before finally standing beside him. She looked around the house one last time, and I could almost see the life she imagined for herself disappearing in real time. Then they walked toward the front door together. Older. Smaller. Strangers wearing the faces of people I once loved. I opened the door while cold evening air drifted into the foyer. My father paused briefly before stepping outside. "I am sorry, son," he said without turning around. I believed he meant it. But some apologies arrived too late to rebuild what they destroyed. I watched them walk slowly down the long stone driveway until the gates closed behind them once more. Then I stood alone inside the silence of my house and realized something the frightened little boy on that rainy porch never could have imagined. The curse was never me.